Konstantin. What are we talking about today?
Very positive feelings of shame and guilt, and I just thought it might be worthwhile for us to recap, as we've had one podcast about it, just to kind of, as a question came in, if we could spend a little bit more time talking about it, because it's a bit confusing. I also, even as a clinician, sometimes when I'm having a conversation with a client, it sometimes takes a while to figure out what the exact feeling is and why it's coming up for that individual. So, and again, very much appreciate that caller actually getting in touch with us to get this question out there. So I know you did a great job last time talking about the distinction. So if you maybe can jump in and talk a little bit more, and then we'll see where we go with that.
Yeah. So shame and guilt, they do feel similar, right? Like if you actually tune into your body,
Sure.
like when you feel really ashamed and when you feel really guilty, you probably kind of feel it very, very similarly. So very similar feelings, both pretty unpleasant. But to put it pretty simply, guilt is usually the feeling that comes up when we've done something bad or wrong or immoral. If you think about it, if you steal money from someone and you have that terrible feeling after,
Right.
That's guilt, right? So guilt is tied to an action, right? Whereas shame is about myself is bad or flawed or not good enough or not blank enough, right? Like me as a person. So shame is more towards me, whereas guilt is more towards my actions,
right?
Which is really the easiest way I can explain the difference between the two.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, I think you said it. Like, there's no one is about a behavior of what has happened, and another one is about just who you are as an individual. Mm-hmm. I've done a bad thing, or I'm bad. Notice the nuanced kind of difference between those two ideas. And you're right. They both feel horrible.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's kind of like eating yourself up alive if you think about it. Like, I'm a terrible person, or I've done something terrible, right? Like, it's just all inside, and it's just it's a difficult feeling, or difficult feelings to have. Now the question is, in a way, well, what do we do with it? Like, how do you approach something as difficult as somebody comes in and says, I'm just bad?
Yeah. I this might sound very overly simplistic.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of simple, right? First and foremost, we have to assess and see if these feelings are appropriate or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, if someone comes into my office and they say, Tim, I'm feeling so guilty, and I'm saying, okay, tell me more. And they say, I just robbed an old woman on the street, and I would say,
right.
Yeah, you probably feel terribly guilty, right? Probably really appropriate, time for that emotion to come out. Whereas if someone is feeling inappropriate guilt, right, when they're feeling that feeling of feeling guilty, but they didn't do anything wrong or bad or immoral, that's when it's sort of like, okay, like what's going on here? And honestly, from a CBT perspective, a lot of cognitive restructuring, looking for evidence, it could be very simple to identify of like, oh, I'm having some sort of irrational thought here that's leading me to feel guilty, although I didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
The cheesy example that I give to clients is goes as such. When my dogs were puppies, we had to put them in their crates when we left the house, because if they didn't, they would eat batteries and like remotes and ant traps and you name it, right? So they were literally a risk to themselves if we didn't put them in their crates. Now, we put them in the crates, and of course, they would cry and they would whimper, and I would feel terribly guilty, right? That feeling was like, oh my gosh. But I had to say to myself, I'm not doing anything wrong or bad or immoral. In fact, I'm doing a good thing by protecting my dogs from themselves. So, technically, there's something that I should feel guilty about, right? And then that thought change or that reframe changed the way that I was feeling about it, right? So, and really, very similarly with shame. Oh, I don't know if you're, not going along with your morals and values and what you see as important, and you're kind of seeing yourself as negative in whatever reason for that way. Okay, maybe that shame is there to kind of like push you in the right direction to be the person that you want to be the blank that you want to be. Um, okay, great. However, if shame is coming up when, oh, I don't know, people are saying to themselves that they're not good enough for XYZ reasons that actually don't really match up, or maybe if it's something that was told to them as a kid, blah, 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 then we have to do some sort of work there. But really, first and foremost, identifying if it's appropriate or inappropriate. If it's appropriate, okay, you kind of feel that feeling. If it's inappropriate, you sort of identify why, and then that, even in and of itself, is a big reframe that would probably do a decent amount of changing that feeling.
Have you ever, something just came up for me, is it, are we going to get anywhere in this conversation if we talk about what comes first and what comes second? Because I can imagine, right, an individual that, let's say, doesn't have those feelings, right, but then is told that you should feel guilty about this, you should feel guilty about that, you should feel guilty about the other thing. Now, do you feel like over time that kind of creates an amalgam of, then it kind of transitions from like, oh, I didn't clean up my bed, I got bad grades, I did this bad, and then all of a sudden from I did this bad to I'm bad because of, look at a collection of things I feel guilty about, almost like seeps in into, instead of external, like outside the internal boundary, to like now it seeps in, and all of a sudden like, well, if I look around and I'm told that I've done all these bad things that I should feel guilty about, then I must be, like, it's almost like an inference.
Yeah, absolutely right. So one question that I ask people a lot is, I ask people all the time about negative beliefs about themselves, right? And so I'll ask the question over and over, what does that say about you, right? Oh, Tim, I got a D on my homework assignment. Like, well, what does that say about you? And someone says, it says nothing about me. It says that, I don't know, that I didn't study, or that, I don't know, I hate chemistry. Like, oh, okay. Well, but if someone says, if I say, you got a D on your assignment, what does that say about you? It's like, oh, then I'm an idiot. And I'm like, okay, like, I am stupid, negative, less than, blah, 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 right? So yeah, and it's so easy for that to happen, right?
Sure.
Like, I don't know, if I do 10 things bad, my brain deduces the fact that I'm just a scumbag, or a bad person, or you name it, right? So absolutely, in a lot of ways, the appropriate feeling kind of should be guilt.
Right.
But oftentimes it can kind of move over into shame when that kind of gets applied to ourselves.
I'm a big fan of using emotions as guidance. So I try to, even in conversations, move over from positive emotion to negative emotion, really more into really effective or ineffective. Now, with guilt, I hope the viewers and the listeners can see that, there's almost like an obvious reason to have guilt, right? Like if you stepped on someone's toe, right, you should probably feel bad about it. If you could apologize, you can move forward. It's a motivating sort of an emotion. Now, what do you think about shame? Like, where do you feel like that falls into? Why is it? What can we squeeze out of shame to be effective? Because guilt, just as we just talked about, kind of makes sense, right? Even like anxiety or anger or sadness, these things could be used, I think relatively on the surface people can tell, well, if you're angry, just you don't like something, right? It just let's move away from that. But what about shame?
Yeah, so I'm a huge proponent of this, right? And I don't know, maybe some people will disagree with me listening to this, but I think shame is hugely motivated, right? I don't know. I think that if we feel like we are not blank enough to a healthy degree, well, then that's motivation for us to be blank enough.
Right.
That's a
good point.
I don't know, if someone's saying like, oh man, like I'm not thin enough, for example, and I don't know, let's say they're overweight. So, okay.
Right.
I'm not feeling the best about myself.
Right.
And so that can motivate me to put in some really hard work to make the change. Or, I don't know, I don't blank enough, or I'm not this enough, or I'm not that enough. It is motivating, right? And this is another analogy or circumstance that I use. If you're a little kid running around the playground and you're knocking over everyone's sandcastle, and no one wants to talk to you because, Tim is a jerk and all he
Right.
does is, knock over people's sandcastles, I'll feel probably pretty negatively about my actions and myself. And then so on the next day when I'm in recess, I'm probably not going to act that way or be that way or do those things.
Right.
Great. I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, and kind of like what you hear, it's almost like we should never feel the feeling of shame.
Right.
Like everyone should feel completely positively about themselves all the time. No. I think we should all feel kind of grubby about ourselves to a healthy degree.
I hear you. I just talk about light bulb, right? Because I'm thinking about from what you're just saying, and it doesn't matter what it is. This may sound controversial or not, but like you're right. In a way, with feeling shame, we could either go the route of like more of an acceptance, right? This is just, let's say, if we use, let's say, being overweight or like maybe not being in the greatest shape that you'd like to be. Either we go with like working on acceptance, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is just what I am, right? Moves away from shame into like acceptance, neutrality about self. Or we use a little bit of shame to kind of motivate ourselves to change into who we want to be. So it's almost like this decision tree that we could go, and I think a lot of even therapies go one way, and I think some therapies go more the other way. It's just an interesting kind of fork in the road, which way you could think of it.
Yeah. I'm not. Listen, like I don't know. It's a very unpleasant feeling.
Right.
But if you ask me, I mean, just like every single feeling that we feel, it's there for a reason.
Right.
And if we're just trying to constantly, combat it or avoid it or fight it or never feel it, I think we're missing out on a whole lot. And I would argue that most of our accomplishments come from the fact that we were displeased in one way or another with ourselves.
Right.
And then that was at least, maybe 50% of the motivation to go ahead and make that change. And so, I don't know, I think shame gets like a really bad rap nowadays.
Right.
Do I think people oftentimes feel way more inappropriate shame than they should? Yes. And that definitely needs to be worked on. But I don't want anyone to get the message that like we really shouldn't be feeling those feelings because it's, if you ask me, I think it's a really, really important one.
Right. No, I hear it, and I hope some of the listeners and the viewers can kind of get behind this idea. There's this just to me an overarching idea, not only shame and guilt, like let's just move away from negative, and we should be in this Pollyannish sort of environment of just feeling positive and obviously as a therapist, just as a person in general, that's definitely very far away from how I think of things, and I think when it comes to just clinical science, if you will, it's just not helpful.
Yeah.
I do like the idea of making the distinction between excessive versus appropriate. I think that's an important element to do. But once you get down to the kind of nuts and bolts about it, if you're feeling shame, maybe there's something to it.
Yeah. And the first point and the first thing I think we need to do, we need to notice the feeling,
mm-hmm.
understand it, identify it, and assess if it's appropriate or inappropriate.
Right. That's step one.
I think that in and of itself already has us in a completely different spot, in a different space. We're mindful of it, we understand it, we're aware of it. Completely different than the mindlessness of these feelings kind of taking the reins without us even realizing. If that makes sense.
Right. No. That I think that first step to separate the two is very important.
And so when you ask that question about like what do we do with it, really I think that first step is just hugely important to understand it.
Right. I also think the one thing, just kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, is this idea about if you're moving in the realm of acceptance, I think spending a lot of time, are you truly accepting it or you're avoiding it by pretending that you're accepting it, right? Because I think that's a thing to keep in mind, because I feel like sometimes people can hide behind this idea, well, I'm just accepting this, while in reality, deep down, they still feel bad about it. So now you're still feeling shame, but you're covering it up with some level of inauthentic acceptance, which then now, then you're creating more layers around an issue that's bothersome to you, and then instead of attending to the issue, then you're stuck between like actually feeling shame, but also kind of having this idea of wanting to accept it, and then there's friction here, which I think I know as clinicians, I mean, I know for me it comes up sometimes in therapy. Just kind of want to throw that out for everybody. Just be mindful. I'm not suggesting anything. Don't accept it. I'm just saying, just be mindful and authentic if you're using shame or guilt to change, or if you're truly working on acceptance, a part of you or part of your behavior. Just be honest about it, because the worst thing you want to do is have those deep feelings that are uncomfortable, and at the same time almost like create like this filter on top of it, which you'll never reach a state that you really want to, which is like contentment.
100%. Being super aware of that.
Right. Because I think a lot of people, like, they confuse the two, and then they're still kind of grumpy about it because they really haven't reached either change that they want or true acceptance, and then they're in that stage and they're not sure what to do.
Yeah, it's like it's just half-assing both of them.
That I think that's our last call, because I think that's to me, I mean, it's a no bullshit way of saying it. It's like half-assing both. You're not really there, and you're not really there, and you're stuck.
Mm-hmm.
You're stuck between pretending that you're accepting it and also avoiding the feeling. So then you're stuck between those two almost like bars.
Right. My last call. Well, my last call. Maybe 2 points. One, just to answer the question again. What's the difference between shame and guilt? Shame is the feeling that we feel when we feel like we're not good enough or bad or flawed or whatever way. Guilt is the feeling that we get when we do something wrong. So shame is about ourselves. Guilt is about our actions. Is really point number one. Point number two, if you ask me, the most important thing that you can be doing with your shame and or guilt is being mindful of it, being aware of it, and assessing to see if it's appropriate or inappropriate.
Right.
If you do that, you're probably going to be in a really good spot with it. And then there's more steps down the line,
right.
But those are my 2 takeaways.
I hear you. And my takeaway, I think, is very simple. Don't BS yourself. Don't BS yourself. Either you're really working on acceptance, but it's honest and genuine, or you're going to be using the feelings of guilt and shame actually to motivate yourself to do things. Don't do it half-assed. Like, just kind of notice where you find yourself. Mm-hmm. You could obviously do both, work on acceptance and also use it in order to improve incrementally, but just be honest with yourself when you're doing it. The worst thing you want to do is pretend you're feeling something you don't, because then you're creating more issues for yourself, and it'll never even out down the road. You're just kind of complicating your journey.
Very nicely said.
All right.
And as always, thank you all for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.
Yeah. Take care, guys. Bye.